Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me for this video. In this tutorial, I will be showing you the process of creating this cherry painting in oils. As a disclaimer, this is just one approach that worked for me for one painting. Oil paint has endless possibilities and techniques, so don't just take my word for it alone. There are so many ways to approach oil painting, and I'm just sharing one of the ways that work for me. The first step before any painting is getting my reference. So I went to the grocery store and bought some cherries. You can make art out of literally anything, anywhere. You do not need a fancy studio. So I set up the cherries on a blue shirt on a laundry basket and took some pictures. I know, so bougie. This is the one I decided to use for my painting. I like to print out my references so I can compare the colors I mix to the reference and get as accurate as possible, but you can also just look at it on your computer screen or your phone, and if you'd like to download this reference for yourself, I made it available for free on my Patreon page. The link will be in the description, and you don't have to be a patron. It's a public post available to anyone for free. Just be aware that your computer screen might show slightly different colors from what I was seeing on my print. And if you print yours out as well, your inks might be slightly different. However, I don't think it'll be too far off, and you should still be able to use the same colors that I did and get similar results. The colors I'm using for this painting are titanium white, cadmium lemon, cadmium red light, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, burnt umber, and ultramarine blue. For this surface I'm painting on, I'm using a piece of Strathmore 400 series oil painting paper, but you can use a canvas or panel or whatever surface you prefer. I think canvas paper is a great way to practice though, because it's not so intimidating and you can cut it up to the sizes you need. This one was cut to 5 by 6 inches, a little bit over. With oil painting, it's great to use some kind of medium that you can add to your paint to adjust the flow of it. For this painting, I'm using Galkyd gel. This will give you a smoother application and decrease the drying time of your painting. I love that you don't need to mix it with anything. You can just plop that right on your palette, and with this specific medium you don't have to worry too much about fat over lean, which can be really intimidating when you're just starting out with painting. Using gel mediums is really easy and convenient, especially when you're starting out with oils. If you don't have Galkyd gel, don't worry, you can still follow along using whatever medium you have, whether it's linseed oil, rublev oleo gel, liquin, or the liquid non-gel form of Galkyd or Galkyd Light. Those will all work. To clean my brushes while I'm working, I will be using Gamsol, which is an odorless mineral spirit solvent. Whenever I need to clean off my brush, I just rinse it off in here and then wipe it on a paper towel, very similar to how you would use water when you're working with acrylics, watercolors, or gouache, any water-based medium. Traditional oils are not water soluble, so you will need some kind of solvent for it. You can also recycle your Gamsol and use it over and over again and save lots of money. I did make a video about that as well, and I will link it in the description. So now, with all that introduction noise out of the way, let's begin actually painting. I'm starting off by taking my filbert brush and dipping it into the Gamsol to load the brush up with solvent. Then I'm mixing it into some burnt sienna to dilute it very heavily, almost to a watercolor-like consistency. This is solely for the purpose of toning my painting surface. I don't like to work with blank white surfaces. I prefer to tone my canvases, and I find this helps me get accurate values faster. I also prefer to use a toned palette as well. As you can see, I don't have a white background on my palette with my paint colors, and I have a video all about underpaintings and using toned canvases, so if you'd like to know more about why I prefer this, that will be linked in the description. And again, it's just my personal preference. If you like to use a white palette and just paint directly onto a white canvas, then go ahead and do that. This is just how I like to do it. Normally, I would tone the entire surface, but here I'm leaving a few blank edges around the sides because I want it to have a rough, painty look without the completed edges. This is really more of a practice study rather than a completed oil painting that takes me super long. Also, when there's more of like an unfinished appearance with rough edges, it just looks cooler in YouTube thumbnails, so small little confession there. Then, using a paper towel, I wipe off the excess burnt sienna from my palette. I also leave my freshly painted surface alone for at least 15 minutes to let the Gamsol evaporate a little bit. Once that tone layer has settled a little bit, I start to draw on all the basic shapes with a regular pencil. Most of the time I actually paint a monochromatic underpainting with burnt sienna to establish all the basic shapes and values, which you will see in my oil painting time lapses, but for this beginner tutorial I'm just keeping it really simple and easy and using a pencil to draw those basic outlines. And if you go to download this reference off my Patreon, I will also have a gridded version so you can get those shapes faster. Using my angle brush, I picked up some cadmium red light. Then I added a little bit of cadmium lemon and alizarin crimson, adding bits at a time to adjust the color in order to match. This color is for the brightest reds in the cherries. I'm picking up some Galca gel and adding that to the color I mixed to make the paint apply more smoothly. While struggling to adjust my second camera, I ended up making an accidental mark, but whatever, it's not the end of the world, it'll get painted over later on. And now I'm applying that color to those areas in the cherries where the red is the brightest. I like the angle brush because it can get good coverage for the larger, bulkier sections while also allowing for more precise outlines. Next, I'm picking up alizarin crimson and mixing it into that brighter red, along with some burnt umber. This is for the darker parts of the cherry, and the alizarin crimson just happens to be the perfect color to use in those areas. I also brought in a little bit of ultramarine blue to darken the color and bring it towards the purple side. The light blue from the shirt was reflecting and combining with the reds in the cherries, giving a dark purple color in some areas. And here I'm blending some of the darker crimson with the bright reds on the painting, creating the gradient transition from the colors of the cherries. It's a little too bright right now, but it will improve as I get further into the painting. It's really just a gradual building process. And if I happen to run out of the color as I'm painting, I just remix it. It's not hard. Once you've already mixed it one time, it's easy to replicate again. Now it was time for the darker colors, so I wiped off all those bright reds from my brush and rinsed my brush in Gamsol and just cleaned it off to get a fresh start. I'm taking ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and burnt umber to create this really dark purple, almost wine-like color for the darkest most parts of the cherries. I'm also blending that with some of the colors I already placed down to create those soft gradient transitions and darken things up a little bit. I would occasionally also pick up some of the reds I mixed and use them with that dark shadow color I made for various parts of the cherries, since none of the colors are ever just applied in harsh lines. With realism, there are a lot of gradients and soft transitions to pay attention to. Now moving on to the second cherry, you can see that I placed the color down to cover the underpainting and then softly blend with the reds. I left the highlight part empty because it's going to be difficult to paint on bright highlights over dark red paint, so I just left them blank and it'll be much easier to get a nice clean highlight. You can fill in that red in that area and just wait for the paint to dry in a couple days and then go in with the highlights, but I personally didn't want to take that approach. And to emphasize once again, that's just my preference. You can do it however you want. There's so many ways to go about it, so it's only just my single approach, and I approach oil painting in different ways for different paintings. So at this point I've switched to a liner brush and I'm just bringing in some more of those deeper reds and blending them with the shadow colors, going back over them and just trying to emphasize some of that color that's in the cherry, just building on it slowly. And as I paint, I periodically dip my brush into that Galca gel to bring into my colors on my palette, and then that brush goes on to the painting. I brought in some titanium white into that dark shadow color along with a bit more ultramarine blue to make it just a little bit lighter and a more visible purple, because that shadow color was appearing almost black and I was seeing a bit more of a purple in that reference photo. However, my print came out a little bit darker and it was harder to tell what color was truly there, so that's why I focused more on like a darker color versus what appears on my computer screen when I look at the reference. Now I'm taking ultramarine blue and titanium white to create this dark purplish blue color. If we look super closely into the reference, you can see right around the tops of the cherries, there's a point where it sort of starts to dip, and this is that purplish blue color I created. It's from the shirt reflecting off of the shiny cherry surface and combining with the dark reds within the cherries, creating a kind of purplish blue color. And now I'm placing that color into those areas of the cherries, adjusting it slowly to make it more accurate. Then, to build more on the color around the tops of the berries, I went back to the darker reds and went over those areas. I also picked up some of the darker color and built more on varying parts of the cherries where I saw that. Sometimes you don't necessarily see what you need to do until you've already laid some paint down, then you can build more on it moving forward. And that's typically how I tend to paint. I don't get everything perfect right from the start. I build on it gradually, and I tend to save the detailing for last. Then I decided to rinse off my brush in my Gamsol because now it was time to fill in those blank highlight spots and mix the colors I need for them. For the sake of example, I've got Photoshop here to observe this highlight area more closely. The highlight on this cherry is made up of 3 sections. The top area here, the lightest part reflecting the most amount of light, and the bottom part. Of course, all the little bits and pieces, little tiny shapes surrounding it, but these are like the general main areas. If we zoom in closely, we can see that this is a warm reddish crimson color, and using this eyedropper tool, this can show me where it falls on the color wheel. The colors surrounding that point where the color falls are a good indicator of which paints you would need to use. And then using the eyedropper tool for the brightest point of the highlight, it appears like a soft peachy color, so using purely white paint is not going to work in making it look as realistic as possible. So the color I'm mixing right now is for the first part of the highlight that I outlined. I'm taking titanium white, a bit of alizarin crimson, some burnt umber, cadmium red, and just kept adding various amounts of those colors until I ended up with a match, and then tried to loosely replicate the shapes I was seeing in that highlight. It looks kind of wonky at first, and this is probably the most challenging part of painting the cherries, for me anyway, but much like I said before, it's just a gradual building process. Once you get some paint down, you can see what else needs to be done, what needs to be changed, altered, or built on. Once that section was done, I moved on to the other cherry, which had a much different highlight shape and a slightly redder tone for that darker section on the highlight, so I ended up using a bit more cadmium red for it. Then it was time to move on to the lightest part of the highlight. So with those reds still on my liner brush and on my palette, I'm taking a lot of titanium white and bringing it into that color to try and replicate that really light peachy color I saw in the highlight. I also added a tiny amount of cadmium lemon because that peachy color was looking a little bit too pink. And then I'm using that color to cover the remaining blank sections where the highlight should be. Again, it looks so wonky here. It's like, girl, what are you doing? But trust me, it's gonna get better. This is where I sort of went back and forth between the highlight color and some dark reds to correct the shape of the highlight, blend certain parts of it out a little, and dab on some of the small dots in the areas where they are needed. That is what my reference is there for, to give me the maximum amount of detail to look at and then work with. And I just sort of make an estimate of what I'm seeing to put on my canvas. And I'm not trying to make it 100% perfect. I'm just trying to get it to a point where it looks real to me. While working on this highlight area, the brightest point still looked a little bit too cool toned for me. So I added some cadmium lemon into that color and then used that altered color just to lightly touch it up in some of the brightest areas. I didn't completely redo it, just a few touch-ups. Then I did the same thing for the other cherry, just of course in a different shape and just slightly warmer colors. And just like for the other cherry, I went back to some of the reds for touch-ups and blending, and just kind of went back and forth there trying to get it to look right. And then I also went back to some of the darkest shadow colors and did a few more touch-ups to add more depth to the cherries. Sometimes the oil gets absorbed into the surface that you're painting on, and it can lose its gloss and looks more matted, not as dark as when you first place the paint down. So you can go back and do some touch-up areas, or when it's dry you can use a method called oiling out, which I'm not going to demonstrate here, but I will in a future tutorial. And I did actually demonstrate it in one of my older time lapses where I painted a water piece and layered it over the course of several months. So you can actually go there and see how I did the oiling out thing. But this is just a far more simple, easier painting, so let's just stick to the very basics. And now to mix the colors on the stems. I'm washing off my brush to get all the reds out of the bristles. Then I'm mixing some cadmium lemon, titanium white, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and cadmium red light to create some separate sections for those colors in the stems. And as you can see, the stems have yellows, greens, reds, and browns in different areas. So here, unfortunately, my camera actually stopped recording as I was placing down the very early part of the stem. You can see the yellows that I placed down. There is a shadow color I'm using now. It's heavily burnt umber and a little bit of ultramarine blue, and it's just kind of mixed in there with my reds as well. So I'm just placing down all the colors that I'm seeing on my reference onto the stem, mixing some cadmium red light with the cadmium lemon for that more orangey reddish part there in the shadow. And now I'm bringing in some more cadmium red into that color and painting on some of those details at the very top. Then going back to the much darker shadow color for the darker shadows on that top little part, whatever it's called. Now it's time to paint the background and really bring this piece together, because I don't know about you, but I am bored of looking at that burnt sienna background and I am ready to fill that space. So I'm taking ultramarine blue, cadmium lemon, and titanium white. This is for the lightest parts of the fabric, and I started off by filling in the space between the two stems. I actually painted a little bit over some of the stem, but I fixed it. And the reason I started with this section specifically is because I thought it was going to be the most annoying and tedious. It's kind of like an enclosed section in the middle, and I have to be careful, so I just decided to get that out of the way first. Then I extended this color to the rest of the background into any area where I saw it, using my reference as a guide and being extra careful not to paint over the cherries. With the background, I decided to make it more painterly with thicker brush strokes, and the angle brush worked really nicely for that. And whenever I needed to paint a smaller section, I would just switch over to the liner brush and get much smaller lines, like the space in between the cherries. I also brought in a little bit more titanium white just to lighten that color ever so slightly, and as I was painting the background I made sure to leave the shadowy areas blank, such as the shadows under the cherries and some of the fabric folds. I'm reserving those sections for darker colors, which I will mix in a moment. And again, if I happen to run out of a color, which does sometimes happen, I just remix it and continue painting. Since I've already made my main outlines in pencil, I'm just using those as a guide for some of the bulkier shadow areas. Now I'm adding a bit more ultramarine blue and cadmium lemon to this color. The extra ultramarine blue is mostly just to darken the color a little bit, ever so slightly, for some of the slightly darker areas in the fabric in this section here. Now it's time to create some of the darker blues for the shadow parts of the fabric. I'm taking ultramarine blue and cadmium lemon, adding directly to the color I was already using, and then going a little heavier on the ultramarine blue and placing that color into some of the shadow areas of the fabric up top. I'm not aiming for perfection or 100% accuracy. This is just an impression of what I'm seeing. As I place shadows down, I'm also lightly blending them with the lighter blue I already had down to create those soft gradient transitions between shadows and light that I'm seeing in my reference. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I'm leaving the edges on the sides unfinished and just letting some of that blank surface peek through. I think it gives it a more raw look to the painting, more like a study rather than a completed painting, but you can do whatever you want for yours. You can cover the entire surface or leave some blank open unpainted edges. Sometimes I just really enjoy that rough unfinished look with a realistic painting. Now I'm bringing in more titanium white back into that color to paint on some rough highlights on those fabric folds and give them a little bit more dimension. So I'm just continuing to fill in the spaces in the painting and cover the underpainting using slightly darker blue paint towards more of the foreground where the cherries are, and then lighter paint for the background. Unfortunately, the way the colors are showing up on camera doesn't really show them as a close match to the digital file I'm displaying on screen, but again, I was working with a print as my reference, and sometimes colors don't deliver 100% accurately in film, but you'll see in the end that the finished painting, the colors were actually a close match to my printed reference. Now that I have most of the underpainting covered, there's just 2 blank spaces left, and it's time to paint the shadows under the cherries. I'm starting off by bringing in some ultramarine blue into that fabric color that I mixed, but this time I'm not adding cadmium lemon because the transition in that gradient from shadow to light had a little bit of blue tint to it, at least in my eyes. Also, the color I'm going to mix for the shadow color, if I just blend it with the light blue paint I already had down without that darker blue transitioning, then it would have a more dull gray effect, and shadows often have transitional colors. In this case, I was seeing more of a blue in that shadow transition, and having that darker blue there is going to help that shadow I placed down not look so desaturated. Now I'm cleaning off my brush to prepare it for the darkest fabric shadow color that I'm going to make. Now I'm taking ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, burnt umber, burnt sienna, more ultramarine blue. Also, I brought in a little bit of that lighter blue into the bottom of that dark shadow color. This color is super dark, and it's for the darkest points in those shadows under the cherries. And it's going to get a little bit lighter as it protrudes more outward away from the cherries, but the darkest point is right where it's closest to the cherries. As I place the shadow color down, I'm also very lightly blending it with some of the lighter blues already on the painting, and as you can see, it combines into a kind of grayish purple tone, which can be adjusted. I just want to get this shadow first and then continue building on it afterwards. There's also a very slight gradient in between the 2 cherries where the shadow just kind of blends into the lighter tone. I think the key to making shadows look realistic is not only to get the right value, but to pay very close attention to the colors within the shadows, because it's usually not ever just one solid color, one even tone. There can be many gradients within the shadows, and values change slightly within those gradients along with the colors, and adding those effects into your painting can make all the difference. So I took some more ultramarine blue and brought some cadmium lemon into it to make a slightly greener tone, because the shadow on my painting looks more on the purple side, whereas my reference shadow has a bit more of a green tone to it. So that's why I brought in a slightly greener color to adjust it and make it a closer match. So here I'm just making some adjustments. I'm adding a little bit more blue to some of the transition between the shadow and light Basically, I'm pretty much done with the painting here. The only thing left to do really is just some minor touch-ups and just continue blending the shadows, getting it to look smooth and correct and just the right colors in the right places. I don't necessarily think that trying to follow every single tiny brush stroke that I make on my painting is what's going to teach you. I think more so this tutorial should serve as an example, as a guide of how you can take your own approach if you are struggling. This sort of gives you a bit of a direction if you don't know what you're doing or which colors to use, but you should still be looking at a reference and painting it yourself. So lastly, I just decided to do some more final touch-ups on the cherries because, as I mentioned earlier in the tutorial, sometimes the oil can absorb into the surface and it loses its gloss a little, and then your shadow colors look lighter because they're not glossy. They just look more matted. So that's why I am just touching that up, trying to deepen those shadows again, make it look shinier. And that kind of tied the piece together. And yeah, hopefully this tutorial has been at least a little bit helpful for you. Here is the final painting alongside the reference, and as you can see, the colors are a closer match to the printed reference versus the digital file I had on screen throughout the tutorial. Colors tend to show up differently in inks and different monitors, so if you'd like to download this reference for yourself to practice, it will be on my Patreon page for free. Anyone can use it. You don't have to be a paying subscriber on my Patreon page. I will leave that link to that specific post in the description. Let me know what you struggle with in painting, and I will try my best to make more tutorials to help you guys out. And if you made it this far and actually watched all the way through, write zucchini in the comments and I will know that you're super cool. But only comment that if you actually watched all the way through and didn't. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'm wishing you all a beautiful and inspiring day, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye guys!